In the summer of 1434, the imperial court at Nanjing gave its assent to an unprecedented order. A fourth treasure fleet would set sail from the bustling harbor of Guangzhou. The decision came from Hongxi Emperor, whose predecessor Yongle had retired the Great Armada after Zheng He's final expedition. Hongxi saw in the distant coasts of Africa not merely exotic markets, but a strategic counterweight to the Ottoman stranglehold on spice routes. He summoned the sons and grandsons of Zheng He, men who had grown up hearing the clatter of massive junks and the call of far-off horizons. The fleet that left in October was larger than any before it, over 200 vessels ranging from towering treasure ships to nimble supply barges, and carried more than 50,000 souls, sailors, craftsmen, diplomats, and scholars. Their cargoes glittered with silk, porcelain, and fine tea. Their stores were stocked with iron tools, bronze bells, and the latest navigational charts drawn by court astronomers. The journey across the South China Sea, through the Strait of Malacca, and into the Indian Ocean was swift, propelled by seasoned pilots who read the monsoon winds as if they were written on parchment. By early 1435, the fleet reached Mombasa, where the Sultan welcomed them with cautious curiosity. The Chinese erected a modest stone pier and began constructing a permanent warehouse, later known as the Guangzhou Wharf of East Africa. From there, they pushed further south to Zanzibar, establishing a small fortified enclave that would serve as a resupply point for future voyages. These outposts were not colonies in the European sense. They were trading stations where Chinese merchants exchanged silk and porcelain for ivory, gold, and locally produced ironware. The presence of Ming officials brought a new legal framework. Contracts were recorded in both Mandarin and Swahili, disputes settled by a council that blended Confucian ethics with local customs. In less than 2 years, the ports thrummed with activity, signaling the first tangible foothold of Chinese maritime power on the African coast. With secure bases along the Swahili shoreline, the Ming Navy turned its gaze eastward toward the Persian Gulf. The Fifth Treasure Fleet departed Guangzhou in 1437, this time bearing a cargo calibrated for the markets of Hormuz and Basra, delicate silk brocades, high-gloss porcelain, and tea leaves prized by Arab merchants. In return, Chinese ships loaded barrels of frankincense, myrrh, and the coveted black pepper that had long passed through Ottoman hands. The voyages were no longer singular spectacles. They became a regular rhythm, one fleet departing each spring, another returning in autumn. The imperial treasury established a bureau dedicated to overseeing these exchanges, appointing seasoned admirals from Zheng He's lineage as chief logisticians. Their reports emphasized efficiency, standardized hull designs reduced repair time, and the introduction of modular cargo holds allowed swift reconfiguration for different trade goods. The impact rippled through the Gulf's commercial networks. Arab traders, who had previously relied on overland caravans guarded by Ottoman forces, now found a maritime shortcut that lowered costs and shortened delivery times. Chinese merchants, in turn, gained unprecedented access to the spice markets of India without crossing hostile waters dominated by Turkish galleys. The flow of goods reshaped price structures. Silk, once a rarity in Middle Eastern courts, became a staple luxury. Pepper, previously hoarded for its scarcity, entered broader circulation across the Islamic world. These exchanges also carried ideas. Chinese astronomers shared star charts that improved navigation across the Arabian Sea, while Persian scholars introduced refined methods of glassmaking to Chinese artisans. The two cultures began a subtle dialogue, mediated by merchants who spoke both Mandarin and Arabic. By the early 1440s, a thriving corridor linked Guangzhou, Hormuz, and the Swahili ports, a corridor that would later extend even farther west. The success in the Indian Ocean emboldened the Ming court to contemplate an even bolder venture, reaching the western seas beyond Africa's southern tip. In 1441, a specially outfitted fleet set sail with a clear mandate to round the Cape of Good Hope and explore the unknown coasts of the newly rumored lands across the Atlantic. The journey tested the limits of contemporary shipbuilding. Ming yards reinforced hulls with additional crossbeams and introduced copper sheathing to protect against biofouling, a modest but effective innovation that extended voyages without frequent careening. After months of battling fierce westerlies, the fleet sighted the Cape in early 1443. The sailors, accustomed to monsoon winds, marveled at the relentless roar of the Atlantic surf. Pressing onward, they navigated northward along a coastline that would later be called Brazil. Upon reaching a natural harbor near present-day Rio de Janeiro, the admiral dispatched envoys bearing gifts of silk and porcelain to the indigenous peoples who greeted them with curiosity and caution. A modest trading post named Tianjin da Dao, Heavenly Port of the Great Way, was erected on a hill overlooking the bay. The settlement served as a hub for exchanging Chinese metal tools, lacquerware, and seed varieties for Brazil's abundant Brazilwood, sugarcane, and exotic fruits. Although the Ming Empire did not intend permanent colonization, the presence of a Chinese outpost on South America's eastern shore signaled an unprecedented reach of Asian maritime power into the Atlantic world. News of this achievement traveled swiftly back to Nanjing via couriers who rowed across the African coast to Hormuz and then overland through Persia to the capital. The emperor received reports that highlighted not only the strategic value of a foothold opposite Europe, but also the potential for new trade routes that bypassed Ottoman-controlled passages entirely. The ripple effects of Ming expansion could not be ignored by the European kingdoms perched on the edge of the Atlantic. Portugal, long obsessed with finding a sea route to India, found its ambitions suddenly redirected. Portuguese royal advisors convened in Lisbon and concluded that competing directly with a Chinese fleet in the Indian Ocean would be futile. Instead, they pivoted toward forging alliances with Ming outposts along Africa's coast, hoping to secure limited trading privileges for European glassware and woolen cloth. Portuguese ships began making regular calls at Mombasa and Zanzibar, delivering small consignments of European goods in exchange for spices and ivory. The Portuguese crown negotiated a treaty that granted them the right to anchor within Ming-controlled harbors, provided they respected Chinese tariffs and customs regulations. This pragmatic approach allowed Portugal to maintain a presence in the lucrative Indian Ocean trade without provoking open conflict with the formidable Ming Navy. Spain, meanwhile, faced an even harsher reality. Its monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, had envisioned a Western expansion that would eventually challenge Asian powers. Yet the sight of Chinese junks patrolling the Atlantic coast of Brazil forced them to reconsider. With their resources stretched thin by the Reconquista and internal consolidation, Spanish policymakers chose to focus inward, strengthening control over the Iberian Peninsula and fostering cultural patronage rather than mounting costly naval expeditions against an empire that could field fleets 10 times larger. The broader European response was one of cautious accommodation. Italian city-states, whose merchants had long relied on Mediterranean trade, began redirecting their caravans toward the newly opened Ming channels, hoping to profit from lower spice prices. The Ottoman Empire, still dominant in the eastern Mediterranean, observed the shift with a mixture of alarm and opportunity. Its trade guilds negotiated new agreements with Chinese officials to preserve overland routes while allowing limited maritime exchange through the Red Sea. Thus, Europe entered the mid-15th century not as a challenger to Asian sea power, but as a regional player adapting to a world where the Ming Navy set the tempo of global commerce. The sustained contact between Chinese shipyards and European ports sparked a modest yet significant flow of technology. In the imperial dockyards of Guangzhou, engineers began experimenting with gunpowder artillery mounted on the decks of treasure ships. These cannons were not intended for conquest, but for deterrence, protecting merchant vessels from piracy along the treacherous coasts of Africa and the Atlantic. The integration of artillery required redesigning ship structures to absorb recoil, leading to sturdier frames and reinforced bulkheads. Chinese craftsmen also refined gunpowder formulas to produce more reliable, slower-burning charges suitable for naval use without compromising cargo space. By the early 1460s, most Ming warships carried a complement of small bronze cannons capable of delivering warning shots that discouraged hostile encounters. Conversely, European sailors brought back Chinese innovations in navigation. Portuguese and Italian mariners who visited Ming ports learned to construct more accurate magnetic compasses based on the Chinese south-pointing spoon, a device whose design had been refined over centuries. They also adopted Chinese star maps that detailed constellations invisible from Europe but crucial for navigating southern latitudes. These tools enabled European ships to venture farther into the southern hemisphere with greater confidence, albeit always under the shadow of Ming maritime dominance. The exchange was reciprocal rather than parasitic. Both sides recognized the practical benefits of shared knowledge. Chinese merchants appreciated the precision of European astrolabes, while Europeans valued the durability of Chinese lacquered hull coatings that resisted rot in tropical waters. This quiet diffusion of technology reinforced a balance where each civilization retained its core strengths while borrowing selectively to enhance efficiency. By the 1470s, a sprawling network of Chinese-run entrepôts had crystallized, linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a single commercial artery. At the heart of this system lay Guangzhou, where imperial officials oversaw the allocation of silk, porcelain, tea, and gunpowder artillery to fleets bound for distant markets. From African ports, such as Mombasa and Zanzibar, caravans carried ivory, gold, and spices northward across the Sahara, meeting Ming-operated caravanserais in Fez and Alexandria. From there, goods were loaded onto Chinese junks that sailed through the Red Sea into the Persian Gulf, then onward to the bustling bazaars of Hormuz. European merchants, primarily Portuguese and Italian, entered this flow at designated customs houses, paying tariffs set by Ming authorities. In exchange, they supplied woolen cloth, glassware, and later, small quantities of copper alloy tools. On the western side of the Atlantic, the outpost at Rio de Janeiro functioned as a transshipment hub. Brazilian Brazilwood, sugar, and exotic fruits were loaded onto Chinese vessels that then crossed the South Atlantic to Lisbon, where they entered European markets under the auspices of Ming-controlled trade licenses. The resulting price equilibrium made silk and porcelain common luxury items among European aristocracy, while spices like pepper and cinnamon, once monopolized by Ottoman caravans, became more affordable across the continent. The network's efficiency rested on standardized contracts, multilingual clerks, and a reliable calendar system that synchronized voyages with seasonal monsoons and Atlantic trade winds. Merchants learned to anticipate arrival times within weeks rather than months, reducing speculative risk. The Ming Empire, for its part, collected substantial customs revenue, funds that were reinvested into shipbuilding, coastal defenses, and the maintenance of overseas warehouses. Thus, a global market emerged not driven by European colonial ambition, but by Chinese logistical mastery, positioning China as the primary conduit through which luxury goods traversed continents. Sustaining such an expansive maritime enterprise placed immense pressure on the imperial treasury. The cost of constructing and maintaining hundreds of junks, staffing distant outposts, and paying crews grew annually. By the late 1480s, court officials began to voice concerns over fiscal sustainability. Debates raged in the Grand Secretariat between traditionalists who argued that the sea expeditions upheld the emperor's mandate to secure tribute, and reformers who warned of draining resources needed for domestic stability. The Hongxi Emperor's successor, Chenghua, appointed a commission led by the seasoned Admiral Zheng Yun, a great-grandson of Zheng He, to evaluate the navy's structure. Their report recommended decentralizing command. Rather than a single imperial fleet operating under direct court control, regional governors would oversee fleets stationed in Guangzhou, Nanjing, and Fujian. These governors would receive autonomous budgets, allowing them to respond swiftly to local trade opportunities while sharing profits with the central treasury through a standardized levy. The reform was contentious. Some ministers feared that dispersing authority could embolden provincial warlords, eroding imperial cohesion. Others pointed out that regional commanders already possessed intimate knowledge of coastal conditions and foreign markets, a practical advantage that could reduce operational costs. After months of deliberation, Chenghua endorsed the decentralization plan, hoping it would alleviate fiscal strain while preserving the strategic benefits of maritime dominance. Implementation proved challenging. provincial governors occasionally clashed over overlapping trade zones, leading to brief skirmishes between fleets vying for lucrative cargoes in the Gulf of Aden. Nevertheless, the new structure succeeded in curbing excessive expenditures. Local administrations could negotiate directly with foreign merchants, reducing bureaucratic delays and cutting down on unnecessary duplication of effort. The internal reforms marked a turning point. The Ming Navy transitioned from a centrally orchestrated marvel to a network of semi-autonomous maritime provinces, each contributing to the broader commercial tapestry while bearing responsibility for its own financial health. As the 16th century unfolded, the world settled into a multipolar trade order shaped by the enduring presence of Chinese maritime law. The legal codes drafted in Guangzhou, detailing standards for cargo handling, dispute resolution, and naval conduct, were adopted by port authorities across Africa, the Middle East, and even the nascent settlements on Brazil's coast. These statutes emphasized fairness, mutual benefit, and respect for sovereign authority, providing a framework that facilitated peaceful exchange among diverse cultures. Europe, though still vibrant in art and scholarship, remained largely a regional cultural hub. Its nations focused inward, cultivating scientific inquiry, literary renaissance, and architectural innovation rather than pursuing overseas empire. The Portuguese, having secured limited trading rights within Ming-controlled harbors, channeled their maritime expertise into shipbuilding advancements that later influenced Chinese designs. The Ottoman Empire retained its dominance over the eastern Mediterranean, but found its monopoly on spice trade eroded as merchants increasingly bypassed overland routes in favor of sea lanes managed by Chinese fleets. The empire adapted by expanding its own naval capabilities, yet it never regained the absolute control it once held over Eurasian commerce. Within China, the legacy of the treasure fleets endured as a source of national pride and pragmatic policy. Imperial scholars recorded the voyages not as heroic sagas, but as exemplars of statecraft, demonstrating how strategic investment in maritime infrastructure could yield lasting economic dividends. The decentralized naval provinces continued to operate, their ports bustling with activity, their ships gliding across seas that had once seemed impassable. Looking back from a distance, one sees a world where the currents of trade were steered not by conquest, but by commerce, where the great arches of history were built upon the sturdy hulls of junks and the steady hands of merchants. The Ming dynasty's decision to keep its fleet sailing after 1433 reshaped global interactions, forging connections that spanned continents and oceans alike. In the quiet harbor of Guangzhou today, the tide still rolls in, whispering of voyages long past and reminding us that history is often a series of choices, some bold, some cautious, that ripple outward, defining the shape of our shared world.